England.
Okay.
They're
Tonight,
Henry Ford changed American life, American business, and Americans.
He has created the people's car. He's brought the first modern moving assembly line.
Power really did change it. He embraced it. He can't control the forces that he has helped unleash.
Henry Ford on American Experience. Exclusive corporate funding for American Experience is provided by Liberty Mutual Insurance.
I'm Sacagawea. I helped Lewis and Clark discover the West. I'm Sacagawea. I helped Lewis and Clark discover the West.
There's more to Sacagawea than Lewis and Clark. Dive deeper into the story of America. Liberty Mutual Insurance, proud sponsor of American Experience.
Major funding for American Experience is provided by the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation to enhance public understanding of the role of technology. The foundation also seeks to portray the lives of men and women engaged in scientific and technological pursuit. Major funding for Henry Ford is provided by the National Endowment for the Humanities, exploring the human endeavor. American Experience is also made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
It would come to be called Fordlandia. 2.5 million acres of virgin rainforest, the size of Connecticut, in the heart of the Amazon. And almost as soon as Henry Ford had wired the $125,000 that made him the sole owner of this vast tract of jungle, he began transforming it.
The Ford Motor Company is ever seeking ways and materials to improve its products. One of the latest enterprises of the company is the development of a rubber plantation in Brazil.
Rubber for tires was his stated purpose. But as with many things concerning Ford, there was a grander vision. In the primordial wilderness, he planned to build a modern utopia modeled on small-town America.
He came to believe that he was not only an economic entrepreneur, but a prophet of proper living.
Henry says simple, plain, honest, hardworking people. That's the backbone of not just the United States, it's the backbone of the world. And I know how you have to live in order to achieve that.
Ford practiced what he preached. Through his own fierce determination, he had risen from obscurity to become one of the most famous and powerful men in the country. With the Model T, the most successful car in history, and the groundbreaking $5 a day wage, Ford ushered in the modern world.
The Model T greatly expanded Americans' mobility, knitting America very close together at the same time that it opened Americans' sense of what was possible. So he liberated, at the individual level, the human spirit.
Henry Ford was a revolutionary. He He changed all of 20th century America. We're living in Henry Ford's world right now.
But no matter his success, Ford remained restless and driven, always seeking to control what lay just beyond his grasp. The creator of an urban industrial age, he longed for the simpler era he had helped destroy. One of the nation's richest men, he despised the wealthy and feared a vast conspiracy threatened to bring him down. A hero to many ordinary Americans, he battled his workers and bullied those who looked up to him, including his only son.
What is it like to carry around so much power that the ordinary wear and tear of reality that most of us deal with all the time, that keep us pretty sane, is absent?
As Henry Ford liked to tell it, his was a rags to riches tale. He was a child genius who fled an oppressive father to become one of the most successful entrepreneurs the world had ever seen. It was a great story, but only the last part was true.
Since young manhood, if not childhood, Henry Ford had felt a certain sense of destiny, that he was slated to do important things. He liked to picture himself to others as a kind of heroic individual who climbed to success against the odds.
In fact, Henry Ford was the eldest son of a caring, successful Michigan farm couple. His parents expected all their children to work alongside them on the land. But when Henry found the work tedious and began obsessing over the machines that might make farm life easier, his parents indulged him. They allowed him to neglect his chores and set up a workbench for him in the kitchen.
Not only would he take apart wristwatches and put them back together, but he would study every machine he saw.
Henry's father, William Ford, understood that his son longed to learn more about machinery. When Henry turned 16, William arranged for him to stay with an aunt in Detroit, and even found Henry a job. On a cold day in December, 1879, Henry walked the 9 miles from his family farm to the city. There, he would reinvent himself. For more than a decade, Ford worked long hours in one shop after another, forging a career as an expert machinist. By the time he was 31, he was chief engineer at the Edison Illuminating Company, the pioneer in providing electricity to American cities. As exciting as Edison was, Ford's passion lay elsewhere.
The notion of horseless carriage was in the air. And he and all of his buddies, they just devoured magazines and newspaper articles. And I think Ford just soaked that up.
Transportation in America was terrible once you got away from the railroads. Terrible. It was an enormous burden. I mean, if you're living on the farm, getting around on land is one of the biggest problems people have.
At the dawn of the automobile industry in the 1890s, most people saw the car as a luxury item for the wealthy. Ford had a different vision. He never forgot his feelings of isolation living on the farm and imagined that others shared his longing for greater mobility. If he could build a reliable horseless carriage, Ford believed he could change people's lives.
He wanted to really change the tenor of his times. He is going to transform the world by building a type of cheap car that everybody could have.
All the late nights and long weekends, the hard-earned cash spent on sheet iron and gasoline, the false starts and wrong turns, none of it mattered. When on June 4th, 1896, Ford drove his horseless carriage through the streets of Detroit for the first time. As the rickety vehicle bounced down Grand River Avenue, a friend cycled ahead to warn pedestrians out of the way. The quadricycle, as Ford dubbed it, had 28-inch bicycle wheels, a top speed of 20 miles per hour, and no brakes. It couldn't go in reverse and was prone to overheating. Yet wherever he went, the quadricycle drew crowds of curious bystanders. Soon he attracted the attention of more than a dozen of Detroit's most prominent leaders, including the mayor himself, all eager to invest in Ford and his machine.
There's some people, when they walk into a room, you notice them. He has an inner self-confidence. That means the way he carries himself, you're going to notice it.
Within 3 years of the inaugural drive, Ford had quit his engineering job. In a brick building on Cass Avenue in Detroit, he assembled a team of 13. The Detroit Automobile Company, incorporated on August 5th, 1899, was one of the first car manufacturing firms in the city, but it wouldn't be the last. The automobile industry was exploding. 57 other firms were founded the same year. Within 2 years, there would be more than 100.
There are all kinds of people that Henry Ford knows that are tinkering and playing and trying to, produce a prototype. All men, all interested in machines, but all without a big picture view of what this could become.
A company spokesman hailed Ford's first model as near perfect. But when it went on sale, it looked more like a horse-drawn delivery wagon without the horse. It was high-sided, heavy, and due to problems with the ignition and carburetor, rarely ran for more than a few minutes at a time. His backers pushed for a new luxury model that was more reliable. But Ford stalled, determined to work out engine and design problems before building another car.
He would move parts around, and then he would test it, and then he would go back and move some more parts. There's a kind of both breadth of vision in that kind of activity, but there's also a kind of monomaniacal focus. No detail is too small, but the overall objective, make the thing better, is never lost sight of.
As his investors increased the pressure, Ford bought himself time by having his employees make parts for vehicles he never planned to build. Meanwhile, he continued to experiment.
His investors want to make an expensive car to sell to wealthy people. Ford disagrees fundamentally. He wants to create a car for the people.
He's trying to perfect an invention. In order to keep doing the trial runs and get it better, it's going to take a lot of capital to keep testing.
Finally realizing they were being duped, his backers pulled the plug. In the 3 years that the fledgling car industry had existed in America, Henry Ford had managed to squander his chance to be part of it. And he knew exactly who to blame: his investors. From here in, Ford declared, my shop is always going to be my shop. I'm not going to have a lot of rich people tell me what to do.
He hated the people that invested in him, loathed them. These were the scum of America to Henry Ford. These are the people that looked down on the slang of the farm and the kinfolk of his that had worked the land for generations. He did not like these people.
While Ford was stalling his investors, he had also been working on a secret project, a race car. Intrigued by the challenge of building an engine that could achieve high speeds, he also harbored a greater ambition, to make a name for himself and start a new car company. In October 1901, Ford took on the most famous driver in America in the first automobile race in Michigan. Interest in the event was intense. Shops closed. One judge adjourned his court for the afternoon, and packed streetcars ran out to the parade ground every 30 seconds. Ford had no experience driving at high speeds and no money to pay a professional, but he had faith in the superiority of his engine.
The whole art of making it in America is about audacity. You've got to be reckless. You've got to take such risk that you can't be afraid to fail.
For the first third of the 10-mile race, Ford lagged behind, struggling to control his car on the curves. Then, on the 6th lap, he started to close the gap. After his opponent's engine overheated, the crowd erupted as Ford zoomed past his rival, winning the race by nearly a mile. The aspiring automaker emerged from the victory a local hero. Henry Ford broke into the front ranks of American racing, crowed the Detroit News, by the wonderful performance of his machine yesterday.
Even after all the failures that Henry Ford had, he was convinced that he should plunge ahead. He wasn't convinced that he had failed. It was sort of a momentary setback. It's an absolute confidence in your own talent and an absolute confidence in your own vision of doing something important.
Ford followed his first win with a string of highly publicized victories. Within months, he had attracted a new slate of investors. On June 16, 1903, he incorporated the Ford Motor Company. Ford's audacity and courage had won him another chance. Within weeks, the company's first model was unveiled, a two-seater with a reliable 8-horsepower engine. The first order came from a Chicago dentist, and much to the delight of company shareholders, the orders kept coming. Within less than 2 years, the Ford Motor Company was producing 25 vehicles a day and had sold more than 1,000 cars. But the man at the top wasn't satisfied. In early 1907, Ford walled off a corner of his factory on Piquette Avenue in downtown Detroit. The room had a door wide enough for a car and a lock to keep out everyone but his top engineers and mechanics. Then he set his team to work. He had them experiment with innovative designs for igniting the engine and a more flexible suspension system. They tried new types of steel that would be lighter but tougher. If a suggestion appealed to him, a colleague recalled, he first showed it in a quick flash of his eyes and an approving smile. He never ran out of ideas, and it was impossible to keep up with him.
He thinks nothing of plunging down onto the floor of the factory and leaping in to help do the job at hand, getting covered with oil and grease, joking with the men, working with the men. He's very loose, very participatory, and they love him.
I think that mechanical intuition that he had created a kind of charisma that drew people to him and drew other creative people to him.
He promoted people who had a drive, people that didn't sleep, people that wanted to work harder, people that weren't in the game because of the superficial reasons, but really wanted to perfect his company.
Every few months, Ford introduced a new model, making his way through the alphabet. But the Model K was too heavy and expensive. The Model N, though lighter and cheaper, had an engine cast in 4 pieces rather than 1 block. Ford kept at it. He wanted to help people, and we as young men in the shop looked up to that, one worker remembered. We could see that Mr. Ford's mind went to the farmer and the mechanic and to the people who lived in the hinterland.
Even if you were on the factory floor assembling these cars, you knew you were part of something that was happening, something that was new, something that was changing the country.
I think it was the same kind of excitement that the Man on the Moon mission people had. There are a handful of those kinds of moments in American history where there's a dream that is so big in its potential and you think you got it, and then you get it.
In October 1908, after 2 years of development, Henry Ford introduced the latest in his alphabet line, the Model T. It had a 4-cylinder, 20-horsepower engine, a vastly improved transmission, and an ingenious magnetic generator that provided power for an ignition and lights. With an open top and an optional cover, it came in just one color, green at first, later black. Weighing only 1,200 pounds, the Model T could go 40 miles per hour on a smooth, straight road. It was also remarkably durable.
They didn't break down a lot compared to other vehicles, and when they did, they were very simple to repair. This wasn't somebody just cheating out a product. This was a quality to the economical car that the world had never even imagined could be possible.
At a time when the average car cost more than $2,000, the Model T sold for just $850, and the price soon would begin to drop. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Orders poured in from doctors, traveling salesmen, artisans, and farmers, people who had never dreamed of becoming motorists.
The Model T changed everything. It gave people a new sense of power and authority and control over their lives. You can go wherever you wanted, and you can go by yourself.
You can get in your car, and you have access now to towns, to cities, to places that were beyond your reach just a few years earlier.
Ford has a sense that this is it, that he's reached some kind of culmination in his work. And I think the sales of the car as they begin to take off only reinforces this notion that he's finally got to where he wants to go.
A farm wife from Rome, Georgia, wrote Ford a letter of appreciation, one of thousands. Your car lifted us out of the mud. It brought joy into our lives. They met at a country dance when Henry was 21. He liked to tell people he knew right away that Clara Bryant was the woman for him. After their wedding, the couple waited 5 years for a baby. Finally, a son arrived. He would be their only child.
Edsel had a very good relationship with his father as a youngster. He admired his father. He was interested in the automobiles his father made. He tagged along with his dad to work.
Henry and Clara sent Edsel to Detroit's most prestigious all-boys school, where he excelled. But Ford wasn't convinced a prep school education was what his son needed most. Henry had barely completed 8th grade. Success, he believed, depended on hard work. His own life proved it.
Henry Ford was not very high on interior life. Sentiment rotted the soul. You could be sentimental if you were action-oriented, but the main thing was to do. What are you doing? Don't tell me what you know. What are you doing? What have you done?
Ford wanted his son to spend as much time as possible in coveralls on the factory floor, where he was tougher on Edsel than anyone else, frequently creating problems for him to solve. Most of the time, the bright and eager Edsel lived up to his father's expectations. "I've got a boy I can be proud of," Henry told a colleague. "He's sure taking an interest in his work."
When they launched the Model T, it becomes clear pretty soon that they have hit a Grand Slam home run and that this market is immense. Think of a gigantic vacuum cleaner right at the door of the plant, sucking every finished vehicle out, like that.
On January 1st, 1910, Ford moved his production line to a vast new factory on the outskirts of Detroit called Highland Park. He declared the company would soon achieve his ambitious goal of producing 1,000 Model Ts a day.
His whole business model is to sell a cheap product. And the way that you create cheap products is by making more of them in a shorter amount of time.
While Ford was able to make the machine parts quickly, assembling the cars bogged down the process.
A friend of Ford's once compared him to a kind of boxer, tiptoeing and dancing around the factory floor all the time, thinking about what could we do here, what could we do there, how could we change the production process to make the car better and cheaper and bring out even more of them.
While they're groping about for improvement, someone begins to think about the meatpacking plant where the carcass of a hog or cow is hung on a conveyor and it moves through the plant past meat cutters who cut pieces off the animal. And what if we turn that around? And what if we put in some machine that we want to assemble and we move it past people and we have people put things on?
Ford's team tried out the idea in the flywheel magneto department, where the device that generated electricity for the ignition system was made. Rather than having one person build a coil at a time, a supervisor broke down the individual tasks into a sequence driven by a conveyor. The new system reduced the time it took to make a magneto from 20 minutes to 13 minutes, 10 seconds.
And then somebody says, well, if it works on magnetos, what about transmissions? What about axles? Well, what about engines? Productivity goes way up. Time to produce a car goes down. And they realize we're really on to something here.
Stationary system, the record time for assembling a car had been 12 hours and 13 minutes. Using the assembly line process, it took 1 hour and 33 minutes. By the fall of 1913, Ford had established the first automobile assembly line in the world and controlled nearly half the American car market. Henry Ford had achieved his coveted goal. His company was now producing 1,000 cars a day.
Efficiency becomes a religion to Ford. Time is a product. You get the maximum you can out of every hour.
Rather than being a craftsman, rather than having a variety of tasks and creating a single product, you were going to stand in one place all day long and do the same repetitive task over and over and over again.
Ford had a tremendous faith that with the principle of assembly line production, anyone could do it. So he didn't require skill. Skill was actually engineered out of it.
People describe him as being less emotional than he was mechanical. He once said that it took 7,882 distinct motions to make a Model T. And then he goes on even further to break that down into how many can be done by able-bodied men, how many can be done by one-armed men. So there's a certain kind of imagining human motion in very rote, mechanical, and dehumanizing ways.
Fancy a jungle of wheels and belts, of men, machinery, and movement, one journalist noted. Add to it every kind of sound you can imagine. The sound of a million monkeys quarreling, a million lions roaring, a million sinners groaning as they are dragged to hell. Many workers found the assembly line so alien, so monotonous and physically exhausting, they quit after just a few days. Company managers calculated that every time they wanted to add 100 men to the rolls, they had to hire nearly 1,000.
Now think about what it costs to find and train and bring workers up to speed in a factory and get them productive and efficient and not making many mistakes. He desperately wanted to reduce turnover. That just made good strategic and economic sense.
You cannot sustain the speed of a line if you have to invest so much of your resources in training people even minimally to do the work. So they have a huge crisis.
With his company's future on the line, Ford would propose an unprecedented strategy, one that would astonish his workforce, confound his competitors, and lead observers to predict the imminent ruin of the Ford Motor Company. In the early days of 1914, Henry Ford convened a top-secret meeting with his senior managers. He spent the first few minutes scribbling numbers on a blackboard. In one column, he wrote $26 million, the company's profits for the previous year. As his colleagues looked on baffled, Ford jotted down another number, $2.34, the daily wage of an assembly line worker. Then he wrote $3 a day, $4.50, and finally, $5 a day. One member of Ford's team vehemently protested, while another fumed silently. Ford stood his ground. A wage of $5 a day, he insisted, would not simply reduce worker turnover, it would increase business.
For most of American history, America was a producer society. The values of production, primarily agricultural production, were the dominant ones. And those values really give way very, very quickly, beginning around the turn of the 19th into the 20th century, into a set of values around consumption. And it's all about, what do I own? How do I get and then spend?
Ford put forward the notion that raising wages would allow workers to be consumers. And whatever you may have lost on the front end, you would get many times over on the back end. And that, he knew, was where the central action was economically in the modern world.
As far as Ford was concerned, the thousands of Model Ts hurtling off his assembly line offered much more than affordable transportation. They promised leisure, abundance, and a shared prosperity. Someday, he imagined, every worker would be able to buy a new Ford car. On January 5th, 1914, Ford went public with his audacious plan. At one stroke, we will reduce the hours of labor from 9 to 8, he told the press, and add to every man's pay a share of the profits of the house. His fellow automakers were appalled by Ford's announcement, certain that higher wages would devastate the industry. One business leader dismissed the idea as the most foolish thing ever attempted in the industrial world. But the real verdict came next morning when 10,000 men showed up at the factory gates, eager for a job at the Ford Motor Company.
Same work, just as boring, just as repetitive, just as hard. But you got people who never dreamed they could make this much money.
Ford's $5 day did more than solve his turnover problem. It transformed him into a national sensation. The story was picked up by papers across the country and around the world. Thousands of newspapers published biographies. The New York Times alone ran 35 stories, and nearly 24 national magazines wrote features.
He has created the Model T, the people's car. He's brought the first modern moving assembly line, and he's revolutionized how workers get paid. People are saying, what's next for this guy?
Lots and lots of people in America and outside of America are fascinated by Henry Ford. And he, seemingly uninterested in money, is very interested in being in the public spotlight.
A few months after his $5 day announcement, Ford established his own moving picture department. Its first production, How Henry Ford Makes 1,000 Cars a Day, was released that summer in movie theaters across the country.
Henry Ford was not bashful about self-promotion. I mean, in many ways, he's the king of it. And, you know, film is another way to promote himself.
Journalists fell for the carefully crafted message. Henry Ford was one of the richest men in the world, the press reported, but money had not changed him. He still loved nothing more than a home-cooked meal and an afternoon working on his farm. He was a genius inventor with simple tastes, despite his dramatic success. There is not much outward difference between Ford and his workmen, a reporter for the Evening World wrote. He is just the hard-working mechanical genius that he was 10 or 20 years ago. Cameras captured him with movie stars, politicians, and celebrities, like aviator Charles Lindbergh and Helen Keller. His idol, the inventor Thomas Edison, embraced Ford as a friend and fellow visionary.
Ford recognizes that he himself is being transformed from a big-time player in the automobile industry to just a big-time player.
He begins to believe the headlines. Henry Ford, the great man. Henry Ford, the folk hero. Henry Ford changing the world. He soaks all of that in, this farm boy from Dearborn, Michigan, and he begins to believe that stuff.
Many of the men who worked for Ford were well aware of their boss's growing ego. And one story in particular served as a warning to anyone who might challenge him. During a summer when Ford was in Europe, his team had built a prototype for a new car. A successor to the Model T, they believed, was long overdue.
Ford comes in unannounced. He walks around the car several times, opens the door on the passenger side, and literally rips it off the hinges. He walks around to the other side, rips the door off the driver's side, and he proceeded to demolish the car by hand.
The message was clear. Henry Ford, and no one else, was in charge. The impression had somehow got around that Henry Ford is in the automobile business, observed a close associate. It isn't true. Cars are the byproducts of his real business, which is the making of men. Ford's $5 day wasn't guaranteed. He called it an incentive wage, and it came with strings attached. Ford required his immigrant workers, who represented as many as 53 nationalities and spoke more than 100 different languages, attend the company's English language school. The school's curriculum relied heavily on mass recitation and included practical lessons based on daily life and routines. After 6 months of study, graduating workers participated in a ceremony called the Pageant of the Ford Melting Pot.
There's a great big pot. The graduates, all dressed in native costume, climbed a ladder up and jumped into the pot and disappeared. Then the teachers came out with big, long wooden spoons and stuck them in the pot and walked back and forth with a little choreography, stirring the pot. The workers come out of the same pot, one by one, wearing a suit, a straw hat, and waving a little American flag.
But Ford didn't limit his reforms to the classroom. He was determined to change how his workers lived. In the months following the $5 day announcement, neatly dressed men prowled Detroit's working-class neighborhoods, seeking out the family, friends, and landlords of Ford employees. They were inspectors from the new Ford Sociological Department, sent to probe into the most intimate corners of workers' lives.
How clean was the house? Did they have drinking problems evident? Did they send money back to the old country, not to be done? Were they legitimately married? Were they keeping boarders in the house? Bad idea. There was a laundry list of what I'd call social engineering. And that was Henry saying, these peasants have got to become Americans. So we're going to use the $5 a day to also Americanize them.
If a worker failed inspection, he was given time to amend his ways, and his additional wages were held for him. If he failed a second time, he was fired.
It's a level of invasion of privacy that is, I think, almost unthinkable in our world. But Henry Ford expected his workers to behave in certain ways, and he was going to enforce that behavior, and there were almost no laws or institutions that stood in his way of exerting that kind of control.
Part of Henry is an idealist. And part of him also thinks that he has the insight to teach other people how to live.
In 1915, Henry and Clara moved into a new home, a fenced and guarded 1,300-acre estate named Fairlane.
The level of fame and celebrity that swoops down on him almost without warning, he was not ready for that at all. There are no neighbors where he lives. Fairlane is an island and a protected one.
The Fords had chosen to construct their 31,000-square-foot home in the farming community of Dearborn, where they had both grown up, rather than the elite suburb of Grosse Pointe, where most wealthy Detroiters lived. They kept to themselves, rarely entertaining. Henry preferred boxing with the men who kept Fairlane's power plant running, or helping his neighbors with their harvest.
Henry Ford remains really an outsider in some very fundamental ways. Though he is one of the richest men in the United States and in many ways in the world at this point, he thinks of himself as a virtuous producer. He is not like those kind of parasitic, in some ways rarefied, elite, out-of-touch bankers and lawyers.
He never wanted to be part of the social elite. He didn't want to interact with Biff and Buff and know the Rockefellers, and he did not care an iota for those people. What he cared about were the fellow people who could talk machinery with him.
Even though he had hated working on the farm when he was young, Ford embraced it now, cutting hay and threshing wheat. He foraged through the woods, chopping down trees and looking for wildlife. He imported 600 pairs of songbirds from England so that he and Clara could watch them together. But the nuthatches, finches, and linnets flew away, never to be seen again. Ford didn't have much better luck controlling his son. He had built Fairlane with his family in mind. 3 large greenhouses for Clara and her roses, and a bowling alley and indoor swimming pool for Edsel. But Edsel was almost never home, preferring to socialize on the other side of the city with the sons and daughters of Detroit's aristocracy. He married into one of the city's elite families when he wed Eleanor Clay, the niece of the founder of Hudson's, Detroit's premier department store.
By the time Edsel was in his early 20s, there's a definite class difference between Edsel and Henry. Henry was, in many ways, a farmer's son. He was very old-fashioned. He was barely educated. Edsel Ford is a very kind-hearted, genteel, quiet young man. He hasn't come up through the ranks in a kind of rough-and-tumble fashion as his father did. And Henry Ford wants to make Edsel into a carbon copy of himself.
Ford insisted that self-discipline had been critical to his success. He rose at dawn and exercised every day. He didn't smoke, never drank, and did not allow alcohol in his house. And he expected the same from everyone around him, starting with his son. During the spring and summer of 1915, Henry Ford began secretly buying up hundreds of acres of farmland along the River Rouge just a mile from his home. Though few knew of it, he had another bold plan in mind.
Ford foresaw a factory, the scope of which, the size of which, the extent of which had simply never been done before.
With tens of millions of dollars in profits a year, Ford had plenty of cash to fund his new endeavor. But once again, he ran into trouble with his investors. On November 2nd, 1916, Ford received an injunction forbidding him from using company funds to build the new plant. Two of Ford's original backers, Horace and John Dodge, were behind the suit. The Dodges complained that Ford was defrauding his investors by not paying out dividends that reflected huge profits.
The Dodge brothers had a very traditional understanding of a corporation, and that is, it is to make a profit for the investors. Ford thought differently. He often described investors as parasites. They put some money in, but they didn't really do anything to make the company grow.
Henry was particularly galled by the fact that the Dodge brothers were planning on using their dividends to expand their own rival car company. After 2 years of legal wrangling, the judge ruled in the Dodges' favor, forcing Ford to pay $20 million plus interest to each of the 7 stockholders who retained minority control in his company.
Henry Ford believes everybody should worship at the shrine that he has created. Anybody that's been part of his operation is either a worshiper or a traitor. They turned traitors.
Early in his career as a car maker, Ford had vowed to rid himself of meddling investors. Now, he would make good on that promise. The announcement began with characteristic grandiosity. "I am very much interested in the future of the whole world," Henry Ford declared in late 1918. But then came the bombshell. The 55-year-old automaker was quitting